Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Chiss Ascendancy and its neighbors in the unknown regions. We are deep in the unknown regions here, which means basically everything we know about this part of the galaxy, we know because Thrawn told someone about it. There are no sector maps to cross-reference, no corroborating sources to confirm anything, which is why we're covering like 10% of the galaxy in one video. It's gonna be a big one, but also we don't have nearly as much detail here as we do in other parts of the galaxy. In fact, you're going to hear me talk about a half-dozen-ish alien nations in this video, each one of which would be at least one full sector by themselves if they joined the New Republic. They aren't going to get full videos because every single one of them would be one of those videos where we don't know enough for me to find anything interesting to say, so the video is only like 45 seconds long. So think of this as an over-sector compilation video, but without any component videos. The Chiss Ascendancy is easily the most famous part of Chiss space, but we don't know a whole lot about it. Thrawn's memoirs focus a lot on his own career, which is mostly spent either in space or visiting neighboring nations as a representative of the Chiss Ascendancy. The Ascendancy is ruled by a council of 9 aristocratic families, and there's a lot of political intrigue and maneuvering going on between them, but Thrawn doesn't generally go into a lot of detail about it. I don't think it's unintentional that Thrawn's whole story is about the Chiss Ascendancy fighting a shadow war with the Grisk across this entire region of space, and yet we almost never see anything of the Chiss Ascendancy itself. Also, Thrawn admits in his own memoirs to lying about how Chiss society works in order to get an advantage on enemies, so probably we shouldn't believe anything he says about the Ascendancy anyway. Vagar Praxit is the homeworld of the Vagari. The Vagari show up in Thrawn's memoirs as pirates, and it seems like they're a consistent pirate problem, unlike the Liao Aoin that we'll get into later, who turned to piracy more recently because of their collapsing economy. There's also rumors on the HoloNet that the Vagari are allies of the Yuuzhan Vong, but this is probably made up. The Yuuzhan Vong are most famous from blatantly fictional stories of their attempted galactic conquest, and it's not clear if they exist at all. If they do, they don't show up in Thrawn's memoirs at all, despite some Imperial propaganda from the Galactic Civil War claiming otherwise. Bardram Scoft is an independent system ruled by the Scofti. The planet has an unstable government and trades off alliance with other powers in the area based on who was most recently assassinated. When the planet's prefect was assassinated, Thrawn, our source for most of what's going on here, was sent on a diplomatic visit, and it was like a normal thing. Like, oh, the Scofti prefect got assassinated and replaced, and who knows whose side the new regime is on. We better send someone to try and talk the new guy to taking our side. They wound up siding with the Liao Aoin against the Chiss, but this was early on in Thrawn's career, which means it was like 5 assassinations ago, and who knows what side they're on now. The Liao Aoin economy was basically imploding at the time, and they were resorting to piracy to keep themselves afloat financially. They needed Scofti space as a safe haven for their pirate ships while raiding other nations like the Chiss Ascendancy and the Garbian Unity. In one of Thrawn's earliest engagements, he helped the Garbian Unity fight off Liao Aoin pirates. The Garbians were ancient enemies of the Liao Aoin and wanted the Chiss Ascendancy's help in a retaliatory invasion, but the Chiss didn't want to get into a full-scale shooting war with the Liao Aoin like that. If you're having trouble keeping track of all these nations that you've never heard of described exclusively in the way they interact with one another politically, then sorry, but our only source for any of this is Grand Admiral Thrawn, and this is pretty much the only thing his memoirs talk about. Like, the Garbians do have an artist market, if that helps, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't a defining factor of their culture. They just knew Thrawn had an interest in alien art, so they took him to a place with lots of Garbian art to peruse while they were trying to convince him to help with their conquest of the Liao Aoin. Ultimately, the Chiss refused, and the Liao Aoin survived to fight another day. Patatas Hiveborn were another long-term enemy of the Chiss that Nicardoon recruited into their coalition. We'll get to the Nicardoon later, but the Patatus and the Chiss had been skirmishing over border planets for a while at the time of the coalition. The Pakian Governance is another Chiss neighbor. They were mostly neutral, capitaled out of a planet called Rapak. And Nicardoon blockade did convince them to join the anti-Chiss coalition, but they were always one of the most reluctant members, attached to the coalition by pretty much pure coercion. Another member of the Nicardoon coalition was the Tower Dimension. Don't be fooled by the name, they aren't from hyperspace or anything. They are a regular nation from the unknown regions, just like the Pakian Governance or the Patatas Hiveborn or the rest of this gaggle of alien empires. They just call themselves the Tower Dimension. Like the Pakian Governance, they didn't have any particular quarrel with the Chiss Ascendancy, but the Nicardoon forced them into the coalition at gunpoint. Nicardoon were a species who invaded multiple worlds in the general vicinity of the Chiss Ascendancy at around the time of the Clone Wars, which was early in Thrawn's career. The dude was about 70 years old when he commanded the Imperial Remnant. Most people don't realize this because Chiss are a bit longer lived than the sentient average, so he looks like 20 years younger than he is. Anyway, the Nickerdun were cultivated as shock troops by the Grisk hegemony, who sought to destroy the Chiss ascendancy, the dominant power of the unknown regions at the time. The Nickerdun subjugated several minor nations on the Chiss periphery before turning inwards towards the Chiss ascendancy itself. But although the coalition was pretty unstoppable on paper, even the Patatas and the Liaoin, genuine enemies of the Chiss ascendancy, had terrible morale and fled easily whenever the battle started to turn against them. This was doubly true for the Pakian governance, who didn't even particularly dislike the Chiss. As soon as the Nickerdun no longer appeared to be in a position to impose dire consequences for desertion, their allies deserted. So the Chiss used skeleton garrisons as a delaying force on every front, while concentrating their forces on chewing up the main Nickerdun fleet. After dealing a decisive blow there, the coalition forces fell back on every front, even if they were winning, because none of them wanted to confront the victorious Chiss fleet. It would be costly even if they won, and whether or not they liked the Chiss, they didn't want this war. Not only that, but the final member of the Nickerdun's planned coalition, the Vak Combine, saw the writing on the wall and sided with the Chiss instead, despite some efforts by the Nickerdun to fool them about the circumstances under which the other members had joined the coalition. In the end, the Nickerdun were fighting against the Chiss and the Vaks together, while the Nickerdun's so-called allies twiddled their thumbs at the border of the Ascendancy, doing as little as possible while maintaining some plausible deniability, just in case the Nickerdun won that battle. When the Nickerdun did not win that battle, their allies just went home. The defeated Nickerdun consolidated around the Patatus, which made a certain amount of sense. The Pakian governance had no quarrel with the Chiss, neither did the Tower Dimension, and the Liaoin had raided Chiss shipping opportunistically because they needed money and the Chiss had more of it than anyone else. But they backed down after losing one battle with the Chiss, and the Chiss refused to help the Garbians, the Liaoin's ancient enemies, with an attempted conquest. So, Chiss-Liaoin relations were unstable, but not openly hostile. The Patatas Hiveborn were ancient enemies of the Chiss. It had been a while since they'd done more than skirmish at the time of the Nickerdun coalition, but still, they were unambiguous, uncomplicated enemies of the Chiss ascendancy. And they still sold the Nickerdun out to the Chiss in order to get out from under their thumb. See, the Chiss have a certain sense of honor to them, and they don't like directly subjugating enemies. Doing so ties up a lot of troops in a part of the galaxy where nobody ever has just one enemy. If you invested all your troops in one direction, you could be attacked from another. So even though the Patatas hated the Chiss, they could trust the Chiss not to do what the Nickerdun were doing, subjugate their world indefinitely. Instead, the Chiss bargained with the Patatas for some intel on both the Nickerdun and the Vagari pirates, a general nuisance in the area, who liked to use the conflict and lack of communication between the Chiss and the Patatus to hide themselves. I mentioned earlier that the whole Nickerdun coalition was masterminded by the Grisk, who provided the weapons, ships, and intelligence that the Nickerdun general Yiv the Benevolent required to get the ball rolling. They still had some arrows in their quiver, including the Kilji Illumine. The Illumine is a militant theocracy who wanted to spread their so-called enlightenment to as many worlds as possible, by force if necessary. The Grisk had already prompted them to make some probing attacks near the Chiss borders during the Nickerdun attacks, but weren't able to wrangle the Kilji into a full-scale attack. The Patatas Hiveborn found out about the Kilji's attacks into disputed space between themselves and the Chiss during and after the Nickerdun remnants' attempts to consolidate in Patatas space, and the Patatas retaliated, destroying the Illumine fleet. The Patatas had been one of the most enthusiastic members of the Nickerdun coalition earlier, so it really says something to the quality of the Illumine's fleet that the Patatas were able to wreck them with minimal Chiss assistance, mostly just intelligence, despite having taken losses in the coalition war. Yagbui were another Grisk client state. They never invaded the Chiss directly, but they did attempt to foment a civil war between the Ascendancy's 9 aristocratic families. It didn't work, but it's something the Yagbui had pulled off before. The Grisk also used the Yagbui to infiltrate the Galactic Empire during the Galactic Civil War in preparation for an attack. Allegedly, because now we should really talk about the reliability of Grand Admiral Thrawn, professional liar. All of this political drama in unknown space comes from the memoirs of Grand Admiral Thrawn, written during the Galactic Civil War. They were recovered and published later, but they're not incomplete. They tell a complete story of Thrawn's career prior to his exile to the Galactic Core, where he encountered the Empire. They give a grand tour of all the major powers in the general neighborhood of Chiss space, and they depict wars there as exclusively a matter of cunning naval maneuvers, tactical ploys, and careful intelligence gathering at diplomatic galas. Everything about Thrawn's life that was glamorous and impressive, and very little look at the mud and blasters on the ground, or even on battles where a simple, methodical plan successfully smashes through an enemy who attempts some intricate clockwork strategy, messes it up, the clockwork jams, and the end result is that his forces are in a very fragile position when the enemy army gets thrown at it like a brick. This is the usual outcome of someone attempting cunning ploys and complex maneuvers in major wars, and it never ever happens in Thrawn's memoirs. His memoirs also paint basically every problem in this entire region of space as being part of the grand scheme of the Grisk hegemony, a shadowy fleet of brutal conquerors led by a strategic genius who threatens to swallow up the entire galactic empire, but who also needed to resort to proxies and coalitions to fight the much smaller Chiss ascendancy. Thrawn depicts the Chiss as winning the war with the Nicardoon through cunning strategy and diplomacy, but stripping away the self-aggrandizement, either this coalition never really stood a chance and all that cunning was wasted, or the Chiss must have taken considerable losses in a hard-bitten, skin-of-their-teeth victory. No strategist is so brilliant that they can reliably turn a defeat, even a narrow one, into a flawless victory in which they take no losses. It might happen ever, but it's not something they can do whenever they want. And looking at Thrawn's career in the Galactic Civil War and its aftermath, where we can corroborate his story with other sources, he's one of the more feared Imperial commanders, despite working with less material than, say, Grand Moff Tarkin, but he doesn't have a track record of outmaneuvering enemies so flawlessly that he never takes any significant losses and walks away from every battle immediately prepared for another one. So I don't believe that the Grisk posed a major threat to the Galactic Empire, or that they pose an existential threat to the New Republic now. Thrawn said so, but Thrawn's a liar. The Chiss must have walked away from the Nicardoon War, as described by Thrawn, considerably weakened, and if the Grisk were that powerful, they would have taken the opportunity to deliver the finishing blow themselves. Did you know that Thrawn claims the Chiss hyperspace navigators are called the Skywalker Corps? That sounds made up. Like, he had just been absorbing a bunch of Clone Wars propaganda films, because studying the art of enemy cultures to learn about them is a whole thing with him, and so that name was knocking around in his head when he needed to make up a lie on the spot. I really hope he was talking straight to Darth Vader when he improvised that name. I doubt Grand Admiral Thrawn made up any of these nations from whole cloth. We know from his work with the Empire, which is corroborated by other sources, that he uses deception as an effective weapon. He's not a compulsive liar. Please stop calling every dishonest person a compulsive liar. Thrawn tells lies for strategic purposes to serve his own ends. Telling lies that could be disproven by sending one ship into the Chiss Ascendancy's astropolitical neighborhood and noticing that some or all of the nations Thrawn claimed to have fought with or against were totally made up would be a pointlessly sloppy lie. For that reason, I suspect the broad history of the Nicardoon coalition and war are mostly accurate. I think Thrawn probably took the opportunity to give the war the Papanoida treatment, painting it as a duel of genius intellects, first between himself and Yiv the Benevolent, General of the Nicardoon, and then between himself and Jixtus, secret agent of the Grisk, describing a war fought entirely with fleet actions, champagne diplomacy, and espionage. The things Thrawn was personally present for and good at, partly for reasons of self-aggrandizement, but also because this is a work of art created by a man who learns about his enemies through works of art. I am very confident he was careful to only reveal information about the Chiss Ascendancy that could already be safely assumed from what the galaxy already knows about Thrawn, putting a spotlight on every Chiss capability he personally exemplifies in order to distract from how he's not giving any additional information about anything accomplished by any Chiss other than himself, thus keeping their abilities secret from potential enemies. But also I think he's flat out lying about the scale of the threat posed by the Grisk. Ultimately, if the Empire decided to bother unpicking the unknown regions not of hyperspace routes, I think they could have crushed the Chiss and the Grisk both, and Thrawn's goal was to point them towards the Grisk as much as possible. I also suspect, since this seems like a book intended for public consumption at some point, that Thrawn was hoping to use the threat of invasion by the Grisk as a means of justifying the oppression of the Empire as a necessary evil to fortify the galaxy against an external threat. This alien invader narrative gets used this way a lot. Even some rebel propagandists got in on it with the Sea Ruvi, dinosaurs with blasters who allegedly attacked the rebel fleet after the Battle of Endor before being heroically fought off. The Grisk story isn't nearly that stupid, but I still don't buy it. Now, I will say this much in Thrawn's defense. Galactic power is not measured by the amount of space you control. Space is mostly literal empty space. Only the planets in between, an astronomically puny fraction of the total volume, actually counts. And I mean astronomically literal. This is the situation for which astronomically large and small things were defined, a category so insanely past anything else we deal with that we needed a new word for it. You've seen videos. You know these things end up with more zeros than are allowed by the Yavin Convention. Any given sector has 80 million star systems in it, roughly, about 1,000 of which have some kind of arable land or mineral resources or energy source or astrographic position between other inhabited planets to be worth building something on. So it's hypothetically possible that somewhere out there is the galaxy's most insanely lucky sector with 80 times more usable planets than the rest of the galaxy put together, and that's where the Grisk live, a sector where every single planet is both inhabitable and worth colonizing. But if the Grisk have that much power, they sure aren't flexing it very much, and the fact is, Thrawn is a professional liar. He brags about his cunning ploys and strategic deceptions. He's not a sociopath or a narcissist. There's people he won't lie to because he needs to maintain a trustworthy reputation with them, but the general public are absolutely not in that category. So anytime you're hearing anything about the politics and history of Chiss space and its immediate environs, remember, our only source on that is a guy who's probably trying to trick you. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Spinward's frontier, by which I mean all the territory between the Republic's Spinward sectors on one end and the Rakatan remnant on the other, but which isn't in Chiss space. The Chiss get their own video. Unlike the territory of the Republic, the unknown regions aren't divided into sectors, so I kinda have to freestyle the borders here. The Spinward's frontier is a region I made up to match the structure of my usual sector-based videos. Also, although we're dealing with parts of the unknown regions that are on the borders with freestanding subsectors, so there's lots of known planets with long histories with the Republic, none of this region is fully explored. Don't be surprised if there's an entire alien civilization out there that we just don't know about because we didn't check the right planet until last week. See, the way space is explored, exploration vessels plot short hyperspace routes from one star to the next and either send probe droids or else personally go down to check which planets have a breathable atmosphere. Now, for every one inhabited planet in the galaxy, there are, no joke, about 100,000 star systems with no inhabited planets. That does include places like Dagobah that have a breathable atmosphere but no one actually living on them. Mostly that is the hundreds of billions with a B planets that have no breathable atmosphere in the first place. They don't show up on maps because no one cares about a planet you can't breathe on when there's so many you can to go around. But if you want to pick out a lifeless rock to suffocate on, you really are spoiled for choice, even in the core. So when explorers are trying to go as far into unknown space as possible, they can get like 5,000 light years in by following a spaghetti trail of planets 4 or 5 light years away from each other. But if you want to find all the decently usable planets and make a new sector out of them, you have to visit tens of millions of solar systems looking for the good planets. You can do 3 or 4 star systems a day usually, and it's pretty obvious from orbit whether or not there's any life on a planet. But even so, the usual strat here is to have like 10,000 guys in ships the size of YT freighters. Sometimes literally a YT freighter. They're flexible ships, they can be used as explorers. And those guys spent like 3 years cataloging 10 million planets, and at the end of it you found 1 or 2 good ones that'll make for sector capitals, and a few hundred other decent ones that a colony ship might settle for if they really want a planet for themselves, which a lot of people do. All this is to say that there is a huge amount of unexplored space between each planet I'm talking about today, so don't be surprised if it turns out there's like 12 sectors worth of cool stuff that we don't know about because the long-range explorers didn't happen to pick the right star systems on their way to the edge of the galaxy, and nobody's sunk in the resources needed for a complete survey of that part of space. That's why it's the unknown regions, even though we do know about a bunch of stuff out here. There's huge blank areas in between the points of light, and we have no idea what's in between. So, the Redoubt is a Chiss stronghold far removed from the rest of their space. The planets there are mostly garbage, but the Chiss built their civilization-scale panic room there because it's close enough to Chiss space to be plausibly reached by exiles or refugees, and the stars are packed tightly enough together to make hyperspace navigation slow and difficult, requiring several jumps, which means there's lots of defensible choke points. I think this is probably our clearest indication that Thrawn isn't giving us a comprehensive picture of Chiss society. He talks about Chiss society like it's 100% cunning aristocratic geniuses who value careful maneuvers and espionage the way he does. But then the one part of Chiss space that we can corroborate is a fortress. I suspect Thrawn, being our main source on Chiss society, is intentionally trying to keep its capabilities secret by focusing only on the ways it resembles himself, someone who we already know a lot about. Iokath and Zakul are described almost exclusively by pulp serials. During the Galactic Cold War between the Republic and the Sith Empire in the Old Republic era, a Sith Lord named Vidyate left the Empire and sought out an ancient superweapon, a vast armada from the unknown regions called the Eternal Fleet, operated by an army of droids. Vidyate used this to build the Eternal Empire, capitaled on Zakul, a planet whose native people had long been used as testing ground for Iokath's weapons before they were destroyed by a mysterious supership called the Gravestone. Eventually, the Eternal Empire returned to conquer the galaxy, and both the Republic and the Sith Empire were forced to unite to defeat it. Does this sound like a garbled retelling of the Jedi Civil War to anyone else? Old Republic era, a mysterious superweapon from the unknown regions gets discovered by a Sith Lord who uses it to conquer the galaxy. The only new touch is that this Sith Lord is a third faction to an existing frozen conflict between the Republic and another different Sith Empire. The Eternal Empire definitely has non-Sith vibes, but according to the legends, their ruler is still a Sith. How many ancient superfleets are we meant to believe are just lying around in the unknown regions? If we're to believe the whole Eternal Empire of Zakul happened at all, I would strongly suspect that the origin of the Eternal Fleet is wrong. It's not an unrelated fleet that happens to be located in and function almost identically to the fleet Darth Revan created with the Starforge. It is the fleet Darth Revan created with the Starforge, or part of it at least. I totally believe that Revan created a backup fleet with the Starforge and hid it in the unknown regions somewhere. That way, they would have a backup fleet if something ever happened to the Starforge. The Starforge's whole thing is its ability to produce stupendous amounts of war material by eating stars, and Revan wasn't on any kind of deadline to invade the Republic. There was no compelling reason not to create a backup fleet, especially since the Starforge itself was capable of maintaining itself across several millennia of inactivity. So it's entirely reasonable to think that the fleets it creates could last at least a few decades on autopilot under droid maintenance, which is all the time Revan would have needed it. After turning against the Sith Empire as a failed experiment, Revan famously left for the unknown regions. Possibly they were trying to recover the fleet but met with some fatal misadventure along the way. Or they might have decided this whole galactic conquest thing was just a bad idea and given up on it. In that case, the Eternal Empire might have found Revan's abandoned fleet over Zakul and started using it for their own purposes. This would mean that a lot of the alleged details of the fleet's backstory are false, but it's not super well sourced anyway, and even if I'm speculating wildly, I find it much easier to believe that there was one Starforge that got used multiple times than that multiple different civilizations independently invented some kind of Starforge, and yet every single one of them collapsed, leaving behind only a few scant traces of their former empire. Ilum is a planet with deep ties to the Republic despite never having been in Republic space, because it was the primary source of Kyber crystals for the Jedi. Kyber crystals are an incredible power source. A lightsaber can last for centuries without being recharged or refueled in any way, and Kyber is the only power source compact enough to fuel the planet-destroying laser of the Death Star. Unfortunately for Ilum, but fortunately for the galaxy in general, you won't get a planet-destroying superweapon out of a Kyber crystal small enough to fit in a lightsaber hilt. The Empire strip-mined the planet for Kyber so aggressively that you can see the scars from orbit. Even the first Death Star was so Kyber-hungry that Sixth Black Sword made some expeditions to other planets in and around the unknown regions to get more, like Jeddah. And after 2 Death Stars, the only Kyber left in Ilum was in the planet's molten core. So, the First Order hooked the core up directly to a giant laser on one end, some engines on the other, and turned the whole planet into Starkiller Base. I guess they were hoping the third time would be the charm. The First Order did always have a problem with trying to recreate the Galactic Empire exactly, even though, the Empire lost the war. One of the other planets that Black Sword mined for Kyber was Jeddah, a moon orbiting the crystalline planet Na-Jeddah. Na-Jeddah is kind of like Ferrix. It's got a breathable atmosphere, you can live there, but there's no arable land, so you have to live on imports. Unlike Ferrix, no one ever dumps a bunch of valuable salvage there, so Jeddah is a moon, but it's the world people care about. It doesn't have as many Kyber crystals as Ilum, not nearly, but they're much more easily accessible. Plus, the Jedi kept the location of Ilum secret, while Jeddah was more known to the galaxy. During the High Republic era, tons of Force traditions gathered there to commune with the crystals, and the planet decided not to join the Republic in order to preserve its position as an independent meeting ground with no allegiance to any one way of thinking. This didn't stop the Odd War from breaking out for control of the planet's holy sites, but the Jedi were in a pretty good position to keep things tamped down. Their mastery of the Force was sufficient that they had the respect of other Force traditions, but their most sacred sites were all on planets like Tython, Ossus, and Coruscant. They weren't interested in controlling any specific sacred site on Jedi, only in being part of the Conclave of the Force, and their position on that conclave was unimpeachable, so their only goal on Jedha was to keep the peace. That doesn't mean they were shining superheroes who never did anything wrong. The Jedi habit of accepting some injustice in the name of preserving peace certainly scarred Jedha once or twice, but they never wanted to conquer the planet outright, which made them a valuable counterbalance to some of the more aggressive Force traditions. The Force traditions on Jedha were all pretty united in their dislike of the Empire on account of the Great Jedi Purge, but also really didn't want to draw the Empire's attention. This worked for them until Director Krennic got his hands on Project Stardust. It had been languishing after the sterilization of Geonosis, but he'd finally maneuvered himself into a position to get it done. Keenly aware that a lot of Imperials had built their careers around the Death Star being a boondoggle doomed to failure, and were desperate to make sure it failed, Krennic was racing to complete it before Palpatine pulled the plug. And while Ilum has an insane amount of Kyber, that's because the Kyber goes insanely deep, where it is also insanely difficult to mine. Krennic turned to other sites like Jedha to get Kyber faster after the surface deposits on Ilum were exhausted. The local Force traditions hated the way their sacred sites were despoiled for industrial purposes, especially since they guessed, more or less correctly, that the Kyber was being used for some kind of enormous stockpile of weapons. Saw Gerrera's partisans had their origins on Onderon all the way over in the Inner Rim, but the large number of sympathizers on Jedha led them to make their headquarters there, especially since they guessed, correctly again, that whatever the Empire was up to on Jedha would be disastrous for the galaxy if it wasn't stopped. It's pretty well known how that turned out. The Death Star got all the Kyber it needed despite Saw Gerrera's best efforts. Test firing of the weapon obliterated Jedha's capital city and ruined the planet's environment. The atmosphere was still breathable, and the ground was still intact, so the partisans kept using it as a base, but Saw Gerrera was dead, the Imperial operations on the planet were complete, and skirmishes with the garrison left behind were largely conducted out of spite and a lack of ideas for where to go next. That's where Leia Organa found them, soon after the Battle of Yavin, helped them take out some of the remaining Imperial operations that they'd been banging their head against, and convinced them to join the Rebel Alliance. The mining operations they targeted were desperately trying to pull any remaining Kyber out of the planet, which was always kind of stupid because the Death Star's attack was centered directly on the Kyber mines. That shit was gone. The first Death Star had gone the worst possible way for them, though. Alderaan's destruction enraged the galaxy, and a week later, the Death Star's destruction made the Empire look weak. The Empire was desperate to re-establish control over our rapidly disintegrating Outer Rim, and hoped they could still make the Tarkin Doctrine work if they built a second Death Star and didn't lose it this time. It's really emblematic of the lack of imagination Imperial leadership had at the time, even from Palpatine, who used to be a really cunning and adaptable man 20 years before that. Project Stardust having gone about as wrong as it possibly could have, lasting just long enough to unite rebel forces against the Empire, but destroying 0 rebel bases in the process. The Empire's response was to try and do Project Stardust again, and just kinda try not to fuck it up this time. They were so enamored with what the kind of control over the galaxy they thought the Death Star would give them, that they just refused to believe that it wouldn't work, even after seeing it literally explode in their face. Moving on, Parnassus was a mineral-rich planet on the fringe of the Republic's Spinwards territory in the late Republic era. It was colonized by the Constar Mining Corporation, but they abandoned it after their nuclear power network suffered some kind of critical system failure in the network itself, triggering meltdowns across the planet. Over a century later, the First Order rediscovered it while looking for places where they could recruit stormtroopers en masse without tipping off the New Republic to the scale of their operations. Parnassus used to have a pretty good climate, but the nuclear disaster reduced it to a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The carrying capacity wasn't very high, so the First Order didn't find the numbers they were looking for, but they did find Phasma, who later on went on to become the face, so to speak, of the First Order Stormtrooper Corps. General Hux, Admiral Hux's father, tried to play Phasma's Skyer clan and a rival Claw clan against each other to recruit the victors of the ensuing clan war as stormtroopers, presumably as a pilot program for similar operations across the planet. The First Order being what it is, it all immediately went to hell. The Skyer and Claw made an alliance of convenience against the First Order, despite their differences, and Hux's stormtrooper detail was killed to a man. Phasma really hated the Claw clan and threw in with Hux early on in hopes of eradicating them, and then doubled down when Skyer allied with the Claws against the First Order, so her bridges were completely burned. She knew the terrain well enough to help Hux escape until a First Order shuttle arrived to evacuate them. Phasma is the only Stormtrooper recruit from all of Parnassus. She would later assassinate Hux with the help of his son. No one's been back to Parnassus since. As far as anyone knows, it's the same irradiated anarchy as it always was. Exegol is a planet in the unknown regions where an Imperial remnant led by unstable clones of Sheev Palpatine built a fleet to try and re-establish the Galactic Empire. It is a real place, but its depiction in what is technically a Papanoida film is not as reliable as that studio name suggests. See, Baron Papanoida sold his film studio a while after his Clone Wars movies, and the First Order films were made almost directly on top of the events they dramatize. Like, the events of the trilogy's last film hadn't even happened yet when the first film was being made. Papanoida films have a reputation for taking a faithfully, if selectively, depicted set of historical events and welding them together into a compelling story. The Galactic Civil War films take the Anakin is Vader theory as truth. Anakin is definitely the prime candidate for being Darth Vader, but we'll probably never know for sure, and told a story about how Anakin's children redeemed both their family lineage and Anakin himself over the course of the Galactic Civil War. The entire story of the Midrim Offensive got completely skipped over, unless you count the Battle of Hoth, but the middle of the film of the trilogy is called The Empire Strikes Back and effectively carries that on-the-run mood of the era while keeping the story laser-focused on Luke, Leia, and Vader. Contrariwise, the First Order films were made before all of the events had actually happened, so they had no chance of figuring out what their narrative was going to be until they were already 2 films in. Adding on to that, 2 different directors worked on the trilogy and they had directly opposed ideas for what the narrative of the trilogy should be. It's a confused mess made as events were unfolding, which means it put unconfirmed rumors into movies with the Papanoida Arts logo on them, but Baron Papanoida wasn't involved. Yes, Baron Papanoida had to commit to certain unproven theories in order to make his movies, most notably the Anakin is Vader theory, and the specific dialogue and choreography of his scenes are basically written from scratch. Rebel Pathfinders weren't Mandalorians or anything, but this specific shot was chosen because it was cinematic, not because Baron Papanoida was faithfully recreating the part of Han Solo's memoirs where he said, "Then me and my team stood directly in the line of fire while breaching the door of an enemy facility, ignoring nearby cover like idiots." But there is a massive gap between the creative liberties taken in the films made by Baron Papanoida himself and the films that came from his studio afterwards. The First Order movies did have a team of field researchers who went to active war zones to gather information for the films as best they could, and that does mean that these movies are probably closer to accurate than, say, the Dark Empire serial fiction that got posted to the HoloNet as events were unfolding, and later got packaged into a data cartridge for store shelves. But don't be confused into thinking that these films are as reliable as the ones made by Baron Papanoida personally. All this to say that, allegedly, Exegol was the site of Emperor Palpatine's cloning operation and, allegedly, was the site of a massive fleet-building enterprise that produced a fleet capable of conquering the galaxy from the resources of one planet, each ship of which was, allegedly, equipped with a Death Star super laser. And I don't believe it. And Dark Empire, another ripped from the headline serial that was written by some rando in the Inner Rim, scraping together a story from whatever rumors and reports were leaking out to the rest of the galaxy. The commonalities are a fleet built in secret by a clone of Emperor Palpatine trying to recreate the Sith Empire from a stronghold located on a single planet that isn't easily accessible to New Republic forces. And from that, there are 2 possibilities. Number 1. Palpatine found or created a Rakatan Starforge like the one Darth Revan used in the Jedi Civil War. Or number 2, this is all made up. The Imperial Remnant just gathered a bunch of Star Destroyers left over from the Empire in secret and waited for the New Republic to fully decommission the old Rebel fleet before making their move. Writers of historical fiction copied the entire fleet from nowhere aspect from Darth Revan with no basis in fact. I find the second one more likely. If there was a second Starforge, Revan probably would have found that one and used it too. And I doubt Palpatine was capable of building a Starforge in secret when he already torpedoed the economy making the Death Star, and his backup plan was another, slightly smaller Death Star. The cool thing about the Starforge is that after you use it to conquer the galaxy, you can use it to make consumer goods. You still have to eat stars, and that's got all kinds of gravitational knock-on effects for the environment, but if you're committed to doing it anyway to fuel your war machine, you can probably do it again to rebuild the galaxy afterwards. The Death Star can't do that. And Exegol does sound a lot like it was a core world from Sith space in the Old Republic era. It's a hidden world in an unknown region of space, just like Sith space used to be back in the early and Old Republic eras. It's a confluence of dark side energy that allegedly holds the secrets of immortality, similar to how Korriban and Dromund Kaas were described in the Old Republic era. It's a stronghold of ancient Sith industry, an entire planet turned into a factory for war machines, like Zeost crossed with the Starforge. And it's a convenient explanation for how the First Order got a fleet out of nowhere, even though it wasn't out of nowhere. Less than half of the Empire Star Destroyers are accounted for. There's no way all of those were maintained for 30 years. The economic impact would have been too easily visible, so some of them must have genuinely just rotted away. But it's not hard to believe that the Imperial Remnant might have had a fleet equivalent to Death Squadron squirreled away in a hidden stronghold somewhere. Now, Palpatine loved his weird non-Jedi Force traditions, especially the Sith. Darth Vader's castle on Mustafar is unmistakably using Sith architecture. And Palpatine used his power as ruler of the galaxy to create entire planets to suit his tastes in places like Biss. Exegol's coordinates are far from Sith space, but there's not any major power between them that would have been interested in stopping Sith colony ships, and ancient Sith warriors did have a habit of going on long journeys into distant space, seeking the power of the dark side, some new weapon or technique that only they would have to give them an edge over their rivals on Korriban. And because Sith Lords love to have absolute power over other sentients, if they found a suitable planet, they would round up a colonial population and plant down an enclave where they could be Sith Emperor of a tiny one-planet empire far beyond the reach of the rest of the Sith. So it's not unreasonable that Exegol might be a real colony of the ancient Sith, which Palpatine rediscovered and took over or recolonized. So, does Exegol actually exist? Or is it just a hallucination of people jamming Darth Revan's superweapon as an explanation for any time an unexpected enemy fleet shows up from the unknown regions? Honestly, I'm not sure. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the area of the unknown regions that I'm going to call the Trailing Frontier. This is the part of the unknown regions that borders the galaxy's freestanding subsectors on the trailing end, and the standard caveats about the unknown regions being unknown still apply. The Trailing Frontier is the least explored part of the entire galaxy. Half the planets out here are just places people go into exile in, like Ahch-To, where Luke Skywalker went into exile after the fall of Ben Solo, and Odessen, where Satele Shen went into exile after failing to defend the Galactic Republic from the Eternal Empire. Allegedly. I'm still not convinced the Eternal Empire was real. It's not very well attested in sources, and it sounds suspiciously like a garbled retelling of Darth Revan's Sith Empire, but some version of it might be true, and definitely the part where a Jedi fails to defend the Republic from external invasion and then goes into exile and shame is not at all out of the ordinary for the Old Republic era, which was defined by the constant back and forth between the Republic and the Sith Empire. Luke Skywalker claimed Ahch-To was the origin planet of the Jedi, but that was in his later years, and I honestly think he might have been fucking with us because, how? Losing track of Tython, another alleged origin of the Jedi, which is a planet in the deep core where hyperspace lanes fall apart after 2 minutes of lapsed maintenance, that makes sense. But Ahch-To is just like a planet. It's remote, but it's not particularly hard to get there if you have a map. Did every single Jedi leave their planet of origin and not one of them thought to bring a map? It's clearly an early Jedi site and might even be pre-Republic, but it's much more likely an outpost with a small population than the origin of the whole order, just because an outpost is way more likely to be wiped out or abandoned. Jakku is an inner rim planet with a population of less than 1 million that got famous because it's along the route from the trailing sectors through wild space and into the Negs, and through the Negs into Coruscant. During the Clone Wars, General Grievous slipped through this path for his raid on Coruscant. In the Galactic Civil War, the Rebels took the same route from Endor to capitalize on the route of Death Squadron. The route was no longer unknown. It's not like people didn't notice when General Grievous used it, so the Empire built a base there on Jakku to intercept any more attacks on Coruscant like this, and so this is where the decisive battle of the Galactic Civil War was fought. Luwek is allegedly the home of an empire of dinosaurs with blasters who tried to conquer the galaxy before being heroically driven back by the Rebel fleet, fresh off the victory at Endor. I know a lot of these legends have grains of truth in them, and probably a lot of them are just straightforwardly true and only count as legends because they're unconfirmed. But the C-Ruvi Imperium is made up. There is no planet Luek. There was no secret empire of dinosaurs that attacked the galaxy in the final years of the Galactic Civil War. Batuu is a remote planet that allegedly had all kinds of entanglements in the Clone Wars. Supposedly, Anakin Skywalker went there with Grand Admiral Thrawn before he was a Grand Admiral. This would have been coterminous with when Thrawn was busy fighting the alleged Grysk conspiracy in Chiss space, and while I have some skepticism about the details of that story, I think it's way more believable that he was over there than that he was down on Batuu somehow. Usually it's pretty easy to verify stories about what Anakin Skywalker was doing in the Clone Wars one way or another. There were a bunch of clones around, so either they say that yes, Anakin was totally on Christophsis, or they say no, Anakin never fought on Mygeeto, and that's the end of it. For this story, though, Thrawn is conveniently working exclusively with Anakin, and also sometimes Obi-Wan shows up. Noticeably absent, Ahsoka Tano. Ahsoka Tano left the Jedi Order in the closing stages of the Clone Wars, so this isn't impossible, but golly, it sure is convenient that this story happened to take place during the one time in all of the Clone Wars when Anakin Skywalker went an extended period of time out of contact with the one person who could vouch for the authenticity of this story. Now, in fairness, lots of people on Batuu do claim to be eyewitnesses to Thrawn and Anakin being on the planet, which would normally pass my threshold for something being unambiguously verified. But, number one, Thrawn is involved, and Thrawn is a very good liar, so extra caution is advisable. And two, Batuu is really trying to sell itself as a tourist destination and just so happens to be visited by people who are famous in Papanoida films for bullshit missions that had no impact on anything, but allowed a certain cantina owner to say Anakin Skywalker sat on that very bar stool. Thrawn also allegedly went on a mission to Batuu with Darth Vader. Unlike the mission with Anakin, though, there was a bunch of Imperials on hand, so this would have been a lot harder to fake. They were still Imperials who answered to Thrawn, so, constant vigilance. Thrawn could have faked this if he had some kind of reason to, but I'm not sure what his reason would have been, and the number of people around who would have had to get their story straight means it would have required a lot of effort. Anyway, it's not nearly as hard to believe that Thrawn would have been active in Batuu at this point in history. He was part of the Empire at the time. It's not a stretch at all. Also out here is Lehon, otherwise known as Rakata Prime, capital of the Infinite Empire. The Rakatans had an empire that stretched from here in unknown space where you're so far trailing that you're about to be spinwards again, to all the way in Tatooine, which suggests they ruled at least half the galaxy, although no one really knows for sure exactly how much of the galaxy they controlled at their maximum extent, since they're a pre-Republic empire now known only from archaeology. The Rakatans believed in their genetic superiority and used genetic modification to converge their entire species on a single, supposedly perfect form. Turns out that specific gene code was pretty vulnerable to a specific disease, since not one Rakata had immunity or even resistance to the disease. Something like 99% of the species who died, everyone who wasn't able to completely quarantine themselves. Their infrastructure fell apart, and the survivors were mostly too isolated to survive. This is especially true since the Rakata ran a slave empire in which they were generally badly outnumbered by people who hated them. So once the vast majority of them were killed, slave uprisings would pick off the survivors. Rakata Prime itself had a primarily Rakatan population, and there are still some survivors there. Darth Revan and their apprentice Darth Malak came to the planet and learned how to take command of the Starforge there, a Rakatan superweapon that could eat stars and use the energy to produce entire fleets and armies of war droids. Darth Revan would use these forces to create a Sith empire until they were betrayed by their apprentice Darth Malak, but Malak's attempted assassination failed. The Jedi recovered Darth Revan and altered their memories, converting them back to the Republic, but also erasing their ability to disarm the Starforge, so, oops. Revan was able to find their way back to Rakata Prime, break back into the temple containing the ancient secrets, and then break into the Starforge to destroy it, obliterating the source of their rogue apprentice's power, and sending the Sith Empire into an internecine feud for years while the Republic bit off their outlying regions. Thus was the final remnant of the Infinite Empire destroyed. Nominative determinism loses this one. Unless I'm right about the Eternal Fleet being a creation of the Starforge. In that case, the Infinite Empire's remnants persisted for another few generations. Still got destroyed in the end, though.